Hello, this is Mr. Afterall. I just want to talk a little bit about Exposure by Wilfred Owen. So Wilfred Owen is a guy who fought in the First World War and died in the First World War and wrote poetry about his experiences of the war. It would be fair to say that his experiences of the war led him to feel frustrated and angry about the reasons that he was at war. Didn't really feel like that beforehand. His early poetry about war was a bit more glorifying of war, but his poetry that was written in the midst of war, when he was on leave or in hospital, was critical of war. This particular poem is one where he gets us to consider what it was like for soldiers, to consider their suffering from his perspective, and particularly the suffering of what it's like just to be out in the cold. This poem is about the suffering of sitting out in sub-zero temperatures in the middle of winter, not about the suffering of being shot at. Actually, the importance here is that it is the cold that is so brutally painful to the soldiers. So that's what this poem is about. There is also a little bit of a criticism of people at home not caring. People at home not really caring about the soldiers, and that must have been perhaps what the experience was like. At home there were glorious pictures of people smiling in the newspapers and people fighting a brave fight, but very little about the suffering that the soldiers were experiencing. So Wilfred Owen is trying to give us that perspective, and that's what we get in this poem. So in terms of lines that will be really good ones to memorise and to write about, I'm just going to go through three of them. So the first one, just in the opening line of the poem, it describes the merciless iced east winds that knife us. So that's an excellent quote in terms of language. First of all, we've got the wind is personified. Gives it a heightened sense of aggressiveness and danger in terms of how it's presented. There's also sibilance in there, which makes it sound malicious and sneaky. So we've got that merciless iced east winds, that repeated S sounds that comes in that line. Also the fact that they knife us, there's a sense of like sneaking up and destroying these soldiers, not doing it to their face. They're being double-crossed by the weather. They're being betrayed by the weather, and that's how the weather is presented at that moment. Knives us, excellent verb in terms of how brutal and painful their experience is. And that idea continues throughout the poem. We get the next quote that I think is a good one to remember is, pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. Again, that stealthiness, that sneakiness of the weather. Again, it's personified. It's fingering, it's feeling their faces. There's a sense there, it's feeling their faces, and perhaps they're dead at that moment. Certainly some of them will have died as a result of the conditions that they were facing. Fingering stealth, feeling for our faces. We've got the alliteration of feeling for our faces, again emphasising the aggressiveness of this weather. And then the last quote I think is really good to remember, because this is more of a criticism of people back home. Our ghosts drag home. Ghosts, they've died, they're returning home, shutters and doors all closed. And that is a sense of a lack of welcome back at home. The shutters and doors are all closed on them. They can't gain access to the places that they live. The people back at home aren't thinking about them. At least that's the criticism that he seems to be making. The verb drag, there's that reluctance, that feeling of I don't want to go. We're going in that direction, but that's not where I want to go. So really good language to talk about. I'd encourage again using that verb connotes to zoom in on the language, zooming in on ghosts, zooming in on drag, zooming in on the idea of it being closed, zooming in on merciless. There's no mercy for these soldiers. There's no one feeling sorry for them. There's no one giving them anything good in the midst of this suffering. Zooming in on stealth, fingering. All of those are excellent words to zoom in on, and talking about this verb, this noun, this adjective connotes this. Then talking about sibilance, talking about the alliteration, talking about the personification. Those are excellent quotes to talk about. I hope that's been helpful.